European leaders are stepping up efforts to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron is leading a new diplomatic effort to engage all parties in dialogue. He's been holding talks here in Berlin after meetings in Kiev and Moscow. Macron says there's been no breakthrough, but that he's helped diffuse tensions. Moscow denies claiming it's planning an attack, but is continuing to amass weapons and troops at the border with Ukraine.
In the palaces of power, Europe's leaders are engaging in a diplomatic push to defuse the crisis on Ukraine's borders. The leaders of Germany, France and Poland tried to show a united front in Berlin.
Our common goal is to prevent a war in Europe. The deployment of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine is very worrying, and our assessment here is very much the same, as is our position.
The meeting followed a diplomatic blitz by Emmanuel Macron, who pushed for further talks on visits to Moscow and Kiev.
I believe that we have concrete, practical solutions that will allow us to move forward. We have had the opportunity to discuss this together. I have also had the opportunity to discuss this with President Putin, as I have done with my European partners and several of our allies.
One of those practical solutions could be resolving a long-running conflict within Ukraine's own borders. In the eastern Donbas region, Ukrainian soldiers have been fighting Russian-backed separatists. Over 7 years ago, France and Germany helped negotiate a peace deal between Ukraine, the separatist forces, and their backer Russia. But the ceasefire agreements, the so-called Minsk Accords, never held. Now experts think these diplomatic channels and the Minsk agreements could be revived. But a reduction in weapons and troops along Ukraine's border and in Eastern Europe looks unlikely. The Kremlin denied reports that Putin told Macron Russia would not further increase military tensions and pull troops out of Belarus later this month. Meanwhile, more planes carrying US soldiers touched down in NATO member Poland. While the diplomatic channels are still open, the build-up of soldiers in the region continues.
Well, let's talk about some of the developments with Theresa Fallon, Director of the Centre for Russian Europe-Asia Studies in Brussels. We've heard from Macron saying that they have concrete, practical solutions that will allow them to move forward. Do you have any idea what he's talking about there?
Well, that's quite interesting because it seems that the Kremlin has already tried to step back what Macron has said that he got out of the Kremlin. So I think that's a worrying sign. Also, after he went to Kiev, they both, President Zelenskyy of Ukraine and also President Macron, stepped away from the idea of the Finlandization. That's almost a pejorative about trying to put Ukraine on this path. Maybe they did discuss this, but I think in the public domain, that is something extremely sensitive. And because of 8 years of war and 14,000 deaths in Ukraine, it's actually made Ukraine more pro-Western. So this idea might have reached its sell-by date. This idea of a Finlandization of Ukraine is so sensitive because there's also this kind of growing nationalism in Ukraine because of 8 years of war. Maybe these steps should have been taken far earlier. And in addition to that, I mean, Putin couldn't resist taking a little jibe at President Macron, saying that after 5 hours of dialogue with him, it was torture. So it's kind of a mixed message that the Kremlin is sending in regard to Macron's meeting with him.
What about this talk of proposing a neutral status for Ukraine in order to satisfy Russia's security demands? What do you make of that?
As I just mentioned, that I think that this is one possible off-ramp, but will the Ukrainian public agree to that? And this also sends worrying messages to both Sweden and Finland because they fear that the door to NATO could be closing. Their status is neutral. And what will be the bigger security implications for the region? And many analysts say that if you give that now to Putin, he will ask for more in the region, because let's remember his two grand agreements that he's asked NATO and the US for is that all troops move out of Central and Eastern Europe since 1997, any country that joined NATO. So this might just be the hors d'oeuvre to a much bigger change in the security landscape.
Russia and Belarus are conducting joint drills in Belarus. How do you assess this in light of the crisis?
Well, I think it sends an extremely worrying message, because if you look at the map, Kiev is not very far at all from Belarus. And in addition to that, President Macron said that was one of the things that he received from President Putin, that there would be some form of de-escalation, because that's what everyone wants to see in order to continue dialogue. But President Putin didn't really say that that would happen. He says that he's moving troops, they're doing exercises, nothing to worry about here. But if you look at the strategic map there, I mean, that's an incredible pincer movement. And it means that perhaps Belarus is far more in Moscow's orbit than other people are comfortable with, especially other countries in the region.
What about the Western buildup of troops then, which has begun? Is that the right signal to be sending?
Well, right now there are about 130,000 troops that Russia has put into place. The West is kind of putting in 300 troops to Germany, for example. So I think it's a sign of assurance, because these are members of NATO. But I think that this doesn't even come close to what Russia is doing.
Theresa Fallon, Director of the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you very much for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thomas Silverhorn is a member of the German Bundestag for the Conservative CSU and is the parliamentary group spokesperson for transatlantic ties. Welcome. Macron says we have concrete, practical solutions that will allow us to move forward. What are those solutions?
Well, first, it was high time for the German Chancellor to be in Washington and to dispel any doubts on the new German government. The clear message is we stand united in the transatlantic community. There is a close coordination also in details. And yes, everything is at the table. And what we need now is a clear and concise messaging towards Russia in order to bring them to the table of negotiations.
What is going to bring them to the table, though? What's going to get that dialogue continuing and some sort of solution found?
Well, everything on the table means we have to coordinate ourselves within the transatlantic community on very concrete steps, including economic sanctions, including the entire energy supply, including also the delivery of weapons. Not every partner has to do everything, but we have to have a clear concept and a clear messaging. And yes, talking and walking have to go hand in hand now.
It's been rumoured that Macron is proposing a neutral status for Ukraine to satisfy Russia's security demands. What do you make of that?
We have to be aware of the fact that Putin follows a long-term strategic vision of restoring a sort of former Soviet Union. And at this point, we have to state that there is a systemic difference between liberal democracies and autocracy, between the Western integrated countries in the European Union and NATO and Russia. And here we can only state what has already been stated in the 70s of the last century. We can only agree to disagree at this systemic difference. But bearing in mind those systemic differences, we have to find modus vivendi how to proceed. And now it's up to the negotiating parties to sit together and to define a concept and an object for negotiations, how to shape the entire security architecture. But it's not up to any one of the Western leaders, I would say, to proceed with single proposals. We should stay united and bear in mind the long-term vision of Russia.
Mr. Silverhorn, what would a neutral status for Ukraine actually mean, though? What would that do?
It's up to the Ukraine to decide for themselves where they want to go with European integration, with democracy, with the rule of law. And Russia now sets the entire international order at stake. If the Russian concept is to dominate its neighboring countries, to to attack the sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighboring countries, this is not a common ground for negotiations. So we have to strive to stick to the international public order, and this is the core essence of the messaging we should send as partners in the transatlantic community.
There's certainly a lot at stake here and so much more. Thomas Silverhorn from the German Bundestag, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
For more, let's bring in Bruno Tata here. He's the Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research. That's a French independent think tank. Thanks for being with us. Bruno, multiple diplomatic initiatives are underway to resolve the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Would you say that France, under Emmanuel Macron, is now the main player in leading those efforts for Europe?
Well, not the main player, but clearly Macron thought he needed to take the initiative. I think he does not anticipate that he will be the only leader talking to both Putin and Zelenskyy. But clearly his initiative, which is to be followed by a visit by Chancellor Scholz later in a few days, has triggered some kind of diplomatic momentum. So I would say he's been leading the way, but he's certainly not the only European leader who's going to play an important role in trying to solve this crisis.
So you say momentum is now building in these diplomatic efforts. President Macron claims he received assurances from President Putin that a de-escalation in the Russia-Ukraine crisis is possible. Now, Russia has been downplaying any talk of progress. What's your reading of the outcome of Mr. Macron's shuttle diplomacy this week?
Well, two things. First of all, there's a value in diplomacy in itself. Meeting face-to-face a leader, as Macron's done and as Scholz will do, for 4, 5, 6 hours, it has value in itself because it allows the leaders to better gauge each other and know each other's intention. I'm not saying that Macron looked into Putin's soul, as former President Bush once said, but there is a value in itself in the long meeting face-to-face. Second, there's a war of communiques, and that's a classic. You would anticipate Russia saying something like, of course, we made no commitments whatsoever. Well, I say let's wait and see. If Macron is correct to say that Russia has promised to withdraw its forces from Belarus after the exercises that are going to take place in the coming days, then it would be very simple to verify.
Okay. President Macron made reference, though, to concrete practical solutions for the Ukraine crisis and for addressing Russia's security concerns. What exactly do you think he's talking about there?
He's talking about two different things. You see, there are two separate tracks that both France, Germany, Poland, and the United States and others are trying to explore. There's one track, which is the so-called Normandy format, which is about the implementation of the Minsk II agreements. It's about the domestic future of Ukraine. And Macron, to his credit, has been successful in rejuvenating a format which everybody thought back in November that it was pretty much dead. So that's the first track. The other track is the broader discussion on the so-called security architecture in Europe. And this is about arms control. This is about confidence and security building measures. And that's a discussion that's obviously also taking place at the US-Russian level and at the NATO-Russia level. But there's a European input in that discussion, and that's what Macron is referring to. Is that enough to defuse the crisis? What do I know? It all depends of what Mr. Putin's plans are, and nobody knows what they are. And I'm even sure that Mr. Macron does not know much more as he returns to Paris.
Just briefly, do you see a coherent strategy for shaping the European security architecture between Europe, the US, and NATO in a way that would satisfy Russia?
Well, the first part of the answer to your question is yes, there is a coherent strategy that despite what many commentators say, Europe and the United States, France, Germany, and the US are pretty much on the same page here. There are nuances, of course, but I don't see any significant divergence of opinion or political choices regarding these big issues. And that's what really matters. There's a unity of Europe and there is a unity of the West behind the nuances. Now, do we think that we can produce options and solutions that are acceptable both to us and to Mr. Putin? Unfortunately, I don't think so. And this is where deterrence comes into play, because even if Mr. Putin hasn't yet decided to embark in a major military operation in Ukraine, we have to deter him, to discourage him from thinking he could achieve meaningful military results without suffering extraordinarily severe penalties.
Bruno Tata, Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you.